Hey everybody, excited to get into lesson 2 of On Solid Ground, our class on apologetics, and I hope that you're as excited as I am, although I would find that hard to believe because I really do love getting into this topic about proving God and talking about how we can know there is a God. And so we're going to do this in 2 parts. This lesson is particularly going to be on how you can believe in a God, and then we're going to spend another part of our lesson later this week on how you can believe in the supernatural, and we'll focus more on the concept of miracles when we get into that lesson. Let's start with, though, an idea of the limitations of science. I don't mean that as an insult, as you'll see. I'm very much on the side of science. I think scientists and those who do the thinking on science are brilliant people. They have certain presuppositions. They have a worldview that limits them, but also science itself, because of what it is, limits them. If I define it the way that they would define it, it's the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. That's just kind of the standard definition of science. And it tells, I hope, I think it'll help you realize what some of the limitations are. If you notice there, it requires observation and experiment, which means anything that is outside of the observation and experiment process that is available to scientists today, it becomes something that they are not able to study. Science, by its very nature, must be testable, repeatable, and observable. And you see all 3 of those things up there in that definition. The idea of being able to see the structure and behavior of something through the observation of it requires them to be able to test their theories and make sure that their theories are correct, repeat those outcomes through experimentation, and then observe what is happening. By definition, then, it cannot study what is not testable, or not repeatable, or not observable. And here's what I mean by that. If you look at the process of testing a theory, that you ask a question that you're trying to find the answer to, you do background research, you construct a hypothesis, which is the idea of coming up with an idea or a prediction of how you think things are going to be, what the answer is to your question. Then you test that hypothesis with an experiment. And you'll troubleshoot your procedure, you'll make sure that everything is done correctly, and if it works, then you analyze the data, you draw concrete conclusions, and then you have to test it again and make sure that those conclusions are the same conclusions, your experiment worked the same way every single time, so that you've got a repeatable test in order to prove that what you're doing is not just some fluke, but it truly is something that would happen again and again. That scientific method cannot be used on religion or history or philosophy. It just doesn't. You can't test history, you can't test religion, you can't test philosophy. So science is not the place to come up with theories regarding the beginning of life, because it can't test that. It can't observe that happening. It has already happened. It is a moment from history. It is not something that is happening. Now, they can test what is happening today. They can test what is, and maybe guess that what is happening today also would, you go back far enough, and that's what has happened over time, and you give enough time that those things have caused things to happen the way that they happen today. But that's all theory that is not testable. You can't test God in a tube. You can't observe God the same way you would observe a chemical reaction. And so science is really not the place to go to in order to find answers regarding religion or philosophy and it's not the place to go even for something as concrete and understandable and acceptable as history. Instead, those topics are different than science, and they have to be handled differently. That being said, there's also limits to history and philosophy, and you're going to find the same limits here even in religion. These tend to often dismiss the need for verifiable evidence, meaning we read an eyewitness account of something that happened 500 years ago, and we have no reason without other eyewitness accounts to reject the first eyewitness account. There's no reason to reject it unless we find contrary evidence. And so we don't often need verifiable evidence. History and philosophy, to understand religion, you've got to depend on history and you have to accept the supernatural. That's just, you have to change your presuppositions and your worldview in order to accept religion. But I think there's verifiable reasons for that, and that's why we're going to talk about proofs for there being a God and proofs for the supernatural. It requires judgment of the subjective instead of relying on objective evidence and data. And that becomes important too. Those who want to believe science has all the answers and that everything must be understood through the lens of science, they do that because they want to have inarguable answers and they want to have data that supports their answers. And so they go to a field of study that relies on objective evidence and data. History, philosophy, religion, they don't need those things. They rely on the subjective. And that makes it very, very different than science. And it also makes conversations between the two also difficult. I've heard people make statements like science is based on fact and religion is not. And that used to really make my hair stand up. I'd get really upset about that. I've even heard statements, read them in newspapers that, evolution should be taught in the science classroom and creation should be taught in the philosophy classroom. And I used to get upset because what they mean by that is science is true and creation or religion is false, and therefore it should be studied in a philosophy classroom. But the older I get and the more I think about it, there's a lot of truth to this statement. Science is, if you're only teaching science, should be taught in a science classroom. And origins, I'm not going to call it creation, I'm going to say origins should be taught in a class of philosophy. Because it is not origins, our human origins are the origins of our world, the origins of our universe. Those things are not science. They are philosophy. They are studies of what could happen. They're studies of history. And those aren't necessarily scientific studies. The scientific theories cannot be fact until they are proven. And so creation versus evolution is not really an argument of facts. It's an argument of theory. And so they do belong in a classroom of religion or a classroom of philosophy, or even we could argue they should be in a class of history. They're not, they have no place in the science classroom. That's one thing that really bugs me about the whole discussion is to argue that the theory of evolution should be taught in the science classroom is on no more solid ground than arguing that creation should not. Neither one of them should be in a science classroom because you can't test them, you can't repeat them, you can't prove them. They have to be understood more from a point of mindset, worldview, and presupposition. So let me get into briefly some common philosophical proofs. I did a lesson on this a year ago, soon after we got here, a couple of months after we got here. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time. I'm just going to kind of quickly summarize each of these proofs of God, and hopefully it'll jog your memory. And if not, you can either send me a note and I'll give you more detail, or you can maybe look up that old sermon, although I don't know that it's on the website, so I'll see if I can get it on the website sooner rather than later. But the proof of existence is basically the argument that we exist, and so there must be a reason for things to exist. Matter does not just spontaneously happen. There has to be a source or an origin for matter, and whether you want to argue that is a natural source that has happened over long periods of time, which still doesn't answer the question of where the original matter came from, or whether you want to argue that it comes from a supernatural source, which does not have to explain where the original matter came from, other than it was created supernaturally. That explanation just tends to make more sense if you're willing to accept the supernatural. The proof of complexity is the argument that the world and the universe are so complex that it's hard to believe that it would function without there being some sort of reason for its complexity. Things tend to not grow more complex, but they tend to naturally grow less complex. But the fact that our universe is as complex as it is and continues to go through the natural process of getting simpler, how did it get so complex in the beginning? Then there's the proof of design and order, and this is one of my favorite proofs just because it allows you to go in and talk about so many different aspects of our universe and talk about the cosmos and talk about the universe and the planets and the stars. Just as a quick review, the fact that we exist is due to a lot of very specific details about our universe, things that were put exactly into place in order to allow us to exist. We are in the right type of galaxy. We're in the right location in the galaxy. We're the right distance from the sun. Our Earth has the right rotation rate, and it has the proper tilt as opposed to any of the other planets we are aware of. It possesses enough water to support life. It has the right atmosphere, the right balance of chemicals in our atmosphere to allow for us to breathe and live. There's the correct balance of the tectonic plates on the Earth that allow the Earth to have the right temperature within its crust in order to support life. The position and orbit and size of the moon are all very specific to our planet and allow us to have life. There's the balance, again, of the atmosphere between oxygen and carbon dioxide, and that is supported by animals exhaling carbon dioxide and plants taking in that carbon dioxide and producing oxygen so that we can inhale that. And that balance between plant life and animal life is perfectly designed in order to allow the atmosphere to exist the way it does. The unique properties of water, which there's nothing else like it on Earth, but the way that it works allows for life to exist, and that's why having enough water on our planet is necessary. We could go through 100 examples of the specific qualities of our Earth and why it supports life. How in the world did everything just happen to work out so perfectly and maintain itself so perfectly the way it has to support life? And if you're looking at this from a evolutionary standpoint, how is it that this one planet has suddenly came into being from some sort of accident, and it has just happened to stop in exactly the right place and exist over the course of millions of years? Although we as creationists wouldn't argue for millions of years. There's the proof of communication, that is unique among humans. We love to communicate. We're finding that out particularly right now as we're not able to be around each other. We communicate in such amazing ways. The fact that we communicate at all, why did we humans develop that? There's no evolutionary purpose for it because no other creature has developed that ability the way that we have. We have it for a sense of self-fulfillment, not really for any sort of biological purpose. The proof of morality, the sense of ought that we have, where we think things should be right and not be wrong. We're unique among creatures in having that. The proof of universal law. Law and order is based on a common standard. Where did that common standard come from? The proof of cause and effect. That proof of cause and effect makes a big difference in the way that we function. And there's this sense of every effect must have a greater cause. Well, what could be the greater cause that caused the effect of our universe existing? There had to be something greater than our universe to cause it to happen. The proof of truth, the fact that truth exists, even though postmodernists will argue that point, the fact that truth exists is remarkable, and it is something that really proves that there is some truth giver out there. All of these, though, open the door for the possibility of God, not the undeniability of God. Recognize it still ultimately takes faith. You still have to believe based on faith, and that's not a bad thing. We believe based on faith a lot of different aspects of our life. I believe based on faith that I'm going to wake up to a wife tomorrow who will also wake up to me, and that we will continue to live together and function together and support one another and raise a family together. I go to the doctor based on the faith that that doctor knows enough to make me well, hopefully. Every day I walk outside and believe that I'm not going to float off into the sky somewhere. Now, I believe those things because I have evidence based on a history of those things. But it's still, every day, I must take on faith that those things are going to happen, or else I'd never get out of bed. Unless I floated out of bed because gravity quit. But that's again, I believe that's not going to happen. You still have to decide, based on your worldview, whether you want to or are willing to believe that the supernatural is possible. Ultimately, there is no undeniable proof of God. There is just plenty of evidence to give us the probability of God if we're willing to accept it. And all that just takes us back to our discussion on worldview and presuppositions from last week. We believe because we're willing to believe, but we are not caused to believe blindly. There is plenty of evidence in there or out there to allow us to believe that there is a God, that God is in control, and that God has left evidence of himself. We will continue on talking about why we should believe in the supernatural in the next lesson. So continue to watch these lessons and study, and we'll have time to discuss them on Wednesday night. Thank you for your attention.